Hey friends, Liz here. I am going to show you a few simple ways to make some bread in your house. This base yeast dough is the one that I use for sandwich bread for my family. You can also use it for a very simple artesian bread. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you can also use it to make a focaccia, which is a flat bread that has more of an oily, crusty base. Which works really great for sandwiches or just a bread to pull off and use as a dipping bread to accompany like a soup meal. So just a couple of things about what you're going to need. First question I always get is, what kind of yeast do I use? There are different kinds of yeast. Anything you buy at the grocery store is a dry yeast that's been preserved. So any of those that you find at the store will work. The question is usually, what's the difference? Most yeast will say something like active dry or something like fast rising, rapid rise, quick rise, something to that effect that makes you think speedy. Both of these are yeast. They're both dried and preserved to pause their life cycle because yeast is a living organism. And when we put it into something and bring it back to life, that's what gives our bread that nice lift and fluffiness in comparison to a bread like a biscuit that's made with baking soda or baking powder. The texture of that is slightly different because the leavening agent is not alive. That's caused by a chemical reaction, whereas yeast is something that's living. So the biggest difference between an active dry yeast and something that says fast or quick is that this yeast has to be proofed, which means we put it into warm water and let it come to life before we finish the process of making whatever it is that we're making, whether it's bread or pizza crust or something. A fast rising yeast, number one, does not have to be proofed. You can literally toss this into your recipe with your flour instead of proofing it because the way it's preserved is different. The other difference is this is going to come to a higher lift more quickly. I usually let my bread rise for an hour to an hour and a half. You can get away with about a 45-minute rise with this, but the rise is a little bit more fragile. With this, it takes longer for the bread to rise and get to where we want, but it's a little bit more stable. You're less likely to have your bread loaf fall when you're using this. Now, it does take quite a bit to cause a bread loaf to fall, so don't think, oh, I don't want to use quick yeast because my loaf will fall. Just know that your bread's a little more stable when you're using this one versus this because the rise is quicker. So, for the purpose of this class, I'm going to use regular yeast so that I can show you how to proof it, bring it to life so it can do its best job. If you have yeast that's in a jar or in a large bag, if you shop at Costco or Sam's Club, the amount of yeast in one of these little packets is 2 1/4 teaspoons. That's on the ingredient list that Mary posted as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour my little packet of yeast into a mixing bowl. And then I'm going to mix this with warm water, not hot. If your water is hot, you will kill your yeast. Yeast you have to treat like a baby. And if the water is too hot, you will burn it and the yeast won't grow. It won't do its job. So comfortably warm. If you would let a small child wash their hands in it and not worry about it burning their skin, then it's fine. So 1 1/3 cup of warm water. Now, some recipes call for milk or part milk, part water. You can definitely do that. The difference in the texture of your dough, which is what changes when you use milk, milk gives you a richer, more almost stretchy consistency or tearing consistency. So if you think about the rolls that you buy at the grocery store, like the Hawaiian rolls, where it has that really beautiful tear, those are because there's more fat in the dough, usually because of milk or added butter. A sandwich bread that has more of a structured crumb is made with water. So if you want that richness and that extra tear, you can substitute your water for milk, and it doesn't have to be dairy milk. It can be coconut milk or soy milk or something like that. It gives you a little bit more fullness and a little bit more of that pretty tearing versus water. We're using water today. All right, so I've got my water and my yeast here. And once you've put the yeast in there, you'll notice it'll start to clump. It'll start to get a little bit of a foam to it. That's the yeast coming to life. We've unpaused the life cycle, and now it's going to do its job, which is to foam and grow. So usually you'll let your yeast sit for a few minutes just until you see it doing something. If you're using a quick yeast or a fast yeast, it's not likely to foam because the way that it's paused is different. You just have to trust that your yeast is okay. If your yeast is really old, past the recommended expiration date, there may be some issues with its ability to do its job because yeast does go bad eventually. So just be aware of that. So I've got my yeast there and I'm letting it kind of rest. While it's resting though, I'm going to go ahead and add my sugar. You can use any sugar you want. You can use brown sugar, cane sugar, white sugar, honey. I use honey especially if I'm doing like a whole wheat bread. That gives a really nice complement to that hardiness of the wheat, to use that earthiness that honey offers. The amount of sugar we're putting in here is not much. It's not going to actually make your bread sweet. The purpose of the sugar is to feed the yeast. Because the yeast is a living organism, we need to give it something to eat so that it can do its best job. So I'm just gonna add 2 tablespoons of sugar into that yeast and water mixture. Okay. Just like that. I'm gonna grab a spoon because that's what I forgot. Give it a little stir just to make sure that that sugar dissolves. If your mixture is starting to look like muddy water, then you're doing it right. All right, so after we've added the sugar, we're gonna add some oil. Now, this is where a lot of doughs vary depending on what your goal is for the dough. If you're making something like pizza or a really neutral tasting crusty bread, you can leave out the oil. The oil adds a little bit more flexibility to the crumb structure. It also helps prevent your bread from going stale. It helps to preserve it, but it gives it a little bit more of stretch to the dough so that we're getting more of that nice, soft, almost spongy texture like in sandwich bread. Whereas if you're wanting to make a really crisp, hearty, crusty bread, you can leave this out. Same thing with pizza dough. If you want a more crisp pizza dough, you can leave oil out of it. But I'm gonna add oil, 2 tablespoons of a neutral oil. That could be olive oil, canola oil, grapeseed oil, safflower oil, avocado oil, melted butter, whatever oil you want. I prefer olive oil. Olive oil is a little less neutral tasting than some of the others, but I like the taste of olive oil in baked goods. Partially because that's what we used when I was a kid and made bread, and I feel like that's how bread should taste. And if you know anything about water and oil, they don't mix, so your oil is gonna float on the top. Not a big deal. It'll mix in when we add our flour. All right, so now the last 2 things, salt and flour. Just regular all-purpose flour. I get asked all the time, should I use bread flour? Do not need to use bread flour. Bread flour has more gluten protein in it, vital gluten, which gives your bread a little bit higher of a protein count, which makes your crumb structure a little bit more sturdy. It is not necessary unless you are making a very specific kind of bread. For a basic sandwich bread, basic artesian loaf, all-purpose flour is totally fine. All-purpose flour has a very middle-of-the-road level of gluten in it, which is the protein that's in flour. And bread flour has a little bit more, cake flour has a little bit less, which is what gives you more airiness in cake versus bread. All-purpose flour, the reason it's considered all-purpose is because the protein level in it is a very neutral level, so you can use it for lots of things. So, for the salt in the flour, This is something where some people go wrong with making bread, or their bread doesn't turn out the way that they want. They add the salt into their yeast mixture and then add their flour. Salt is abrasive. It is a very abrasive mineral, and yeast is very fragile. So depending on the hardiness of your yeast, adding salt directly to your yeast mixture can actually kill your yeast. So if you've ever had issues where your bread just didn't turn out, there is a good possibility that you either scalded it by using water that's too hot, you chilled it because you used water that's too cold, or you added salt directly to your yeast and it attacked it. So it doesn't always happen, but it can, especially if you're using something that like Himalayan salt that's more natural, it can be more abrasive. So what you want to do is add a cup of flour first to kind of thicken up and create like a barrier around the yeast. And then you can add your salt in, and it kind of acts as a protectant to that yeast. So we're gonna add 3 1/4 cup of flour. If you don't know this, flour should remain light and airy when you add it into a baked good. If you compress and pack your flour into your scoop, you will end up with too much by weight. If you're making something that needs a very exact measurement, I recommend using a kitchen scale. Otherwise, you can kind of pour it in with a spoon or another scoop. You can use a flour sifter if you have one at home. I just use a second one usually to fill, so that I know I'm not compacting by shoving my scoop down in there. So I've added 1 cup of flour, and I'm just gonna give that a little stir. It's gonna look like lumpy, soupy water, and that's okay. I'm just adding 1 cup first so that I can protect my yeast from my salt. Okay? So, and it's not gonna fully incorporate with just that 1 cup. It's just gonna look kind of lumpy and soupy. Okay? But now that I have that, I can add my salt in and not worry about my yeast being attacked. So, I'm gonna do 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt. Sprinkle that in. 1 1/2. Easy peasy. All right, give that a little stir. Then I'm going to add my 2nd cup of flour. Again, I'm going to keep my flour light and airy in my scoop so I'm not compressing. Sometimes when you measure flour and you end up packing it down, your dough will end up too dry. And you go, oh, I don't know what I did. I added the right amount of flour. More than likely, you have more flour in that scoop than you think you do by weight because it's too compact. So loosening the flour before you measure it is a great idea. So after 2 cups of flour, I have kind of this runny oatmeal consistency. Make sure you have all of that powdered flour incorporated. Scrape the bottom, scrape the sides, just like that. Okay. All right, then I'm going to add my 3rd cup. Just like that. Give it a stir. All right, so now once we've added that 3rd cup of flour, this is when you're gonna start to notice it really start to pull together and change from a soupy consistency to a dough. But it's going to still be goopy. So instead of pulling together into a ball, it wants to, but it's not quite there. It's still kind of sticky. So when I stir it, it wants to pull together, but not quite. So we're gonna add just that last 1/4 of a cup. Just a little bit to help it pull together a little bit more so that we can finish this kneading process on the counter. Okay, so at this point, your dough is gonna start to, when you try to stir it, it's gonna try to cling to your spoon, and it's gonna start to pull together into a ball in the center. Might start to look kind of shaggy, like it's tearing. That's good, that's what you want. We do want it to still look a little bit sticky. We don't want to over flour because then we're going to end up with dense, hard bread, and we don't want that. We want just enough. Okay? All right. So then, once I've gotten to that texture, I'm gonna take some flour and I'm just gonna generously dust my counter here. And then I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna turn it out onto the counter. Okay? All right. And what we're gonna do, I'm gonna scoot this over, make sure you can see what I'm doing here. It's still sticky. So make sure you have flour underneath so it's not sticking to your counter. Then take a little bit more flour and just dust the top. You can kind of spread it around. This way it doesn't stick to your hands. If it's sticking to your hands and leaving a mess, sprinkle some more flour on top of it. It needs just a little bit more. And then we're gonna do a folding technique. So what we're gonna do is, I'm going to do a very basic fold to start with. I'm gonna take one end of my dough and I'm going to just take a rectangle shape and turn it into a square by folding it over and then press down. If it sticks to you or the counter, adjust your flour. And then I'm gonna turn 90 degrees, take my rectangle, and 90-degree turn. Then take that long end, fold it over, push down. Turn 90 degrees, shoop, fold it over, push down. This is a very basic knead. And we just keep doing that until that little bit of extra flour on the counter gets worked into the dough so that it's a more touchable texture, but we are not over drying it by putting a ton of flour back into it. So just keep turning and folding until it starts to pull together. The purpose of kneading is to help the protein in the flour activate that gluten. We're helping that to activate and stretch, and it becomes these stretchy bands in the structure of the dough, which is what's gonna help us have a nice crumb and have a bread that holds together and doesn't fall apart. We don't want to over knead the dough. If we over knead the dough, we're going to end up with bread that's hard and heavy, and we don't want that. So we want to knead it just until those gluten strands have activated, okay? Once it starts to shrink down into a smaller ball, you're just about there. If it becomes too hard to just fold, you can take your fist and create like a pocket. So punch a dent in the middle and pull the dough over your hand and then pull your hand out, okay? Which is all I'm doing here. I'm punching, pulling over, and rotating, just like that. If it gets a little bit tacky, that's okay. A very light dusting so you can handle it. Don't over flour. Okay? We know that our dough is ready when it gives us a nice, holds its shape. It doesn't become soupy flat on our counter. And when you can take your finger and press in and that dent springs back and disappears. If you poke your finger, not aggressively, but tap your finger and make a dent and it pulls back, then it's ready for its rise. If you poke your finger in and it just leaves a divot, you need to knead for a few more minutes, okay? But at this point, this is ready, so I'm gonna let this rest for about an hour to 90 minutes so that it can rise, and I'm gonna show you what to do after the rise next to create your loaf. This dough has sat for about an hour and a half. It's doubled in size. You can see these beautiful holes in the bottom where it's expanded. This is beautiful. This is exactly what we want. Depending on the temperature of your house, an hour to 2 hours to double in size. I would not let it rise more than 3 hours at room temperature. If it's going to be 4 or 5 hours before you can do something with it, put it into your refrigerator to slow that process because we don't want to let it overproof. Otherwise it's going to collapse and it can also start to get more of a fermented flavor, more like a sourdough, but not quite as pleasant because a sourdough has been maintained in a very specific environment. So now, depending on what kind of bread you're wanting after this dough has risen, if you're doing a sandwich loaf, we're just gonna pull this out and pop some of the air bubbles so that the crumb is a little bit tighter and we don't have big air pockets in our sandwich loaf. If you're doing a sandwich loaf, you are gonna want to grease that pan. So I'm just gonna use some spray. You can brush it with butter or oil. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come through here around the side to pop it down. I'm not going to really knead this because it doesn't need it. And again, we don't want to over knead the dough. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a very dense, heavy loaf of bread, and we don't want that. So what I have here is just a very light dusting on the counter, and I'm just going to coat this so that it doesn't stick to me or the counter. And all I'm going to do is just roll this, get a nice smooth top, and tuck underneath. Okay, just like that, easy peasy. I knocked out some of the air when I pulled it from the bowl, so it shouldn't have too many air pockets, and I'm just gonna lay it in there. And it's gonna do a second rise in this pan till it rises another like 50%. If you're doing a sandwich loaf, just to the edge of your loaf pan is good. Usually about 40 minutes is what you want. So that's for a sandwich loaf. That's gonna bake in the oven at 350 for about 30 to 35 minutes. It should get a really nice golden color on the top, really, really pretty. If you use milk in place of water, your loaf will get darker on the top, so be aware of that. 350, 30 to 35 minutes after a second rise. And I'll put the recipe in the comments so that if you have questions, you can refer back. That's for a sandwich loaf. Now, if we want to do a sourdough, or not a sourdough, an artesian loaf, something that's hand-shaped. The meaning of artesian is hand-shaped, easy peasy, which means it's not going into a shaped pan to give it a specific outcome. I'm going to shape a loaf and I'm going to put it on a flat pan for it to do its baking process. For an artesian bread or a flat loaf, long loaf, we want to try to maintain as much of the air pockets as possible because we want a very loose crumb structure. With a sandwich loaf, we want to knock out some of those air bubbles because we want the crumb to be tighter so that it doesn't shred and fall apart when we try to make a sandwich out of it. For an artesian hand-shaped loaf, we want to try to preserve as much of that air as possible and handle it as little as possible. So you can take your hand and kind of loosen around the edges. You can take it and flip it over. It's just kind of whatever your preference is. I'm just going to very gently take one finger and loosen these tips. It is going to drop down some. I'm trying to be really, really gentle, not quite as aggressive as I was with my sandwich bread. Okay, I'm just going around and loosening, and then I'm going to turn it out. Now you can grease or flour your bowl before you put it in for its rise. But adding extra oil to it can change the texture of your bread. So you can kind of see all of these stringy, airy pockets. I want to try to keep as much of that as possible. So I'm just going to very gently pull this back to make sure that there's flour underneath. And then I'm going to very gently shuffle it back the other way. Make sure there's flour underneath so it's not sticking. And I'm going to get some parchment paper. Pan here. Flip it over so it doesn't curl up on me. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to flip it over onto that parchment paper. Very gently. Scoop up underneath and lay it down. Then I'm just going to shape it. If you want it to be more of a basket loaf where it's round, you can shape it into a ball. I like a long loaf. So I'm just very gently pulling the sides in, like that, okay? Now for a loaf like this, we need to do some slashing on the top so that it has a place to expand as it rises, otherwise it's going to tear down the side. So I'm gonna take a serrated bread knife, and there are differing opinions on whether you do this before or after it rises. I find it's easier to do it before it rises because you're less likely to pop it and cause it to fall. So I just come in at an angle with my serrated blade and give it some nice deep slashes right across the top, just like that. And then as it rises, those slashes are going to expand. So again, I'm gonna let this rise about 40 minutes is usually good depending on the temperature of your kitchen, maybe half an hour if your house is really warm. This is going to bake at 450, 20 to 26 minutes depending on your oven. In my oven, 22 minutes is the perfect number. Nice and golden again on top, should look really, really nice and crusty. Now, if you want the crust on this to be really hearty and crunchy sounding, you need some humidity in your oven. You can take a metal pan, like a 8x8 metal dish or a 9x13 metal dish, put just about an inch of water in it and put it on the bottom rack in your oven. Take one of your racks and put it at the lowest slot, put that pan of water in while you're preheating your oven, and then put this in, and that will create steam in your oven, which will give you a really nice, crisp, crunchy outside crust. If you want the crust to be just a moderate crust, but not super thick and crunchy, you can skip the steam and it'll give you a crisp, nice crust without being the kind that you really have to tear, more like a baguette. That it'll have a crust, but not quite as tough. So that's it for those two types of breads. Now, if you wanted to make a focaccia, what you would do, you would take your dough and pop out all those air bubbles, and you would end up spreading it in your pan as if it were pizza dough. Before you would do that though, you would take a pan like a jelly pan, a jelly bar pan like this, something that has an edge. You want to brush it with oil, the whole pan and edge, and then you would press this dough down into the pan until it's edge to edge. And then you would go back through with your fingertips, nice and floured, and poke holes. So once it's spread edge to edge in the edge of the pan, you use your fingertips and cause dimpling to poke some holes. That's what gives it a very distinct focaccia look. And then again, sprinkle or drizzle with some oil. You can sprinkle with some salt and pepper. Some rosemary is beautiful on focaccia. And then that would also bake at 450 in your oven for about 20 minutes until it's a little bit golden on the top, okay? And that's gonna have a nice, rich, oily crust. That's all I have. Let me know if you have questions. I'm happy to help you problem shoot if you have a specific question that I can answer. My timer's going off because I have cake in the oven. But let me know if there's anything that I can help you with. I am happy to do so. Enjoy your bread making.